Hello and welcome to Perennial Podcast, episode 18. I'm here with Ken again, finally. How are you doing, Ken?
Good to be back. Good to have the show running.
So, I think we had in mind today to talk about honor and its relation to suicide, and then possibly the relation of that to the purported white genocide that gets talked about. So, what were your thoughts then? I know this was kind of you had in mind to make a video on this.
Right. You look, the earliest example I know of, and there might be others, is the rape of Lucretia in Western mythology, that she's raped, she commits suicide, and the whole idea there is she's preserving her honor. Now, if you look at, Japanese society, European mythology, usually suicide is centered around a loss of honor. When we talk about the present day, to talk about honor almost doesn't enter into the language. And that's a thing that many people have identified is, the framing of what is linguistically acceptable or mimetically in fashion that determines what concepts we're allowed to talk about, what concepts exist. Because if you go up to people and you start talking about honor, they'll look at you as if, you walked up to them in a suit of armor, or, it's almost a ridiculous notion. And so my thesis here is basically that, one way to engineer someone's suicide, like the rape of Lucretia, is you dishonor them, you physically, violate their honor. And that would be one way to drive them to suicide, that kind of physical abuse. Another way to do it would be with this moral relativism more broadly of saying there's no such thing as honor. There's no way to attempt honor. And at the same time, undermining those institutions from which people have traditionally derived and maintained and preserved their honor. You don't even make that an option anymore. So it used to be, oh, well, you're an honorable man because, you have a wife and you have children and you go to church every Sunday and, you perform your civic duty and your party, your local charity organization or something. Like all these institutions, as they break down, honor becomes less and less powerful. We could also talk about ideals and archetypes and leaders. When we look at politics, that is supposed to be, the leader of the nation. And an honor-based society should be the most honorable man of that society, theoretically. And when we look at, if people do have a concept of honor at all, and you ask them, where is the most honor, where's the least honor, they're probably going to identify, Congress, the presidency, as places where honor is bereft, places where, you're not going to find any honor. So if that's the leadership of the country, and that's kind of traditionally where we're supposed to derive our ideals are from our leaders, then, the message it's sending is that your honor is gone, your honor is stripped from you. And that is a kind of psychic abuse or moral abuse on the same level, I think, with other kinds of abuse that do drive people to suicide. So when we talk about white genocide, I think people get very confused because they think of crematoria ovens. And when you talk about the suicide of the West, I think people also think that, oh, this is some Spenglerian process. This is just like a natural cycle of history or something. And I think both of those are inaccurate for obvious reasons. And I think to talk about engineered suicide, focusing on things like honor, you could also come at it from a Marxist perspective, talking about the economic factors. There's a lot that you could go into. But I think overall the term engineered suicide is an accurate term that really gets to the heart of this larger process.
Yeah, it's a lot of interesting stuff. So, to start, maybe we can just look at the concept of honor and what exactly, if we're going to talk in like strictly biological evolutionary terms, what that's measuring. So, it makes sense that an individual in a social group, like we're a very social species, a marginalized individual that loses status might tend towards suicidal thoughts, might tend towards that kind of behavior, because there's really no redemption if you lose that level of status. But I think maybe you can differentiate status from honor by saying that honor is something like the internal aptness for status. It's correlated with status. So when you gain status, you do tend to gain honor. But if you're gaining status deceptively, like someone in Congress taking money from unsavory agents, this might be a gain in status, but it's not the kind of internal constitution that would be universally applicable in other social contexts. So perhaps we could think of honor as something like the set of internal maxims that generalized would lead in any given social group to an authentic growth of status. And so then that would make sense where, you know, maybe you lose status in one group, but you could always leave that group and be adopted by another. It does happen in nature. But if you feel like you've lost something essential in your soul, your way of being, like this kind of irredeemable, dishonorable feeling, then that would equate with suicide. So what do you think of that relationship between status and honor? Is there another kind of virtue that we should be considering?
Yeah, it's difficult because you look at really high status people. I mean, and the left will do this with Trump. They'll say, oh my gosh, we've made a hero about this guy who is, and they'll use kind of pejorative terms, but maybe perhaps what they're trying to get at is he doesn't have a lot of honor, is one way you could describe it. Again, it's hard because that language has been removed from the vernacular, but we can look at it in terms of the fact that people with very high status don't have a lot of honor. So what is honor then? I think it relates to two things. When I look at European concept of honor, I'm thinking a lot of truth telling. And then when I look at the Japanese concept, I'm looking at a lot of loyalty. And I think those are both, you could say one is fidelity to the truth, one is fidelity to your feudal lord or your feudal master. And they're both, you know, sort of intertwined. I think there's different emphasis there, but it's both about kind of that fidelity to something higher than yourself, something outside of yourself, that you subordinate yourself to. You know, if you're the emperor, the king, you have to subordinate yourself to your duties, your responsibilities, the manners of the court, and all of those things keep your honor intact. So if you do something unkingly or non-emperor like, then you would perhaps lose honor in the view of later kings or other emperors or so on. So that to me, I think, is the essential part of it. And it kind of goes to integrity of personality when we talk about people who are, as you said, people who can kind of move and shift around different groups. I see that sort of happening even with people who are not very honorable, that they're able to move and shift around. And, you know, basically there is no higher thing that they're loyal to. There's no higher truth or lord or master. They're kind of just pursuing their own power or pursuing their own interests or their passions and moving around in that way from one thing to the next. And so they have this, they're actually very good in operating under, you know, low integrity circumstances. Again, the left will say things like Donald Trump is a pathological liar. And so how I interpret that is they're saying that his words don't have integrity. He just says whatever is convenient. He says whatever he needs to say to make the deal happen that he wants. You know, and so when we talk about all the changing and the progressive nature of the left, they're not loyal to any static, like, social hierarchy. They're not loyal to any static much of anything. It's all constantly changing. There's no stagnancy. There's no integrity of personality there. And I also like to note that if there was something you could say they're loyal to, it would have to be the rich, right? Because when we talk about the slurs of racism and sexism, ultimately, rich people can much more easily navigate that than lower class people. And when we look at people like Trump or Kavanaugh being attacked as sexist, it's done because they're seen as symbols of the white working class or of the white middle class. They're not actually symbols of, you know, the white upper class. And and you look at this in South Africa, there was actually an attack recently And the truth is, if you ask, the Boers, the farmers, white farmers in South Africa, they're very upset and afraid about what's going on. But if you talk to the supermodels, white businessmen, the actual white ruling class, not the farmers, they don't control the society, but the white ruling class in South Africa, they're very anti-racist. They're very on board with the ANC. They might want a more moderate, like capitalist friendly guy, but they're not really concerned. They're not like fleeing the country out of fear because they're insulated from these problems. So, I mean, that's the most I think that the left has in terms of its social integrity. Everything else is constantly moving. Of, Hillary Clinton was against gay marriage, now she's for gay marriage, and Obama similarly. So now you have the transgender issue. So things are just moving so rapidly. Like, there is no concept of honor. When you don't have any concept of honor to attach yourself to, you don't have that integrity of personality. And when your personality sort of dissolves morally, then that also leads to the physical collapse of the personality, which is that physical suicide. And I think both of them are intertwined.
Yeah, that's right. So I was looking at the etymology here, and I'll bring that up so people can look with us. And it looks like it does come from a Latin word meaning honor. And then, I don't know what this means exactly, displaced Middle English, honor, dignity among men, but that captures this kind of status element. But dignity is not quite the same as like high status, because a rich person is not necessarily dignified. A politician's not necessarily dignified. So maybe I could, real quick, just go ahead and look up dignity as well. Dignity, where does that come from? Comes from worthiness, merit, grandeur, authority, rank, office. So again, related to status, authority, rank, office. But this kind of worthiness concept, again, refers to that moral integrity underlying what results in honors or the application of status from a peer group. But then there was also that Latin word, and I want to look at that. So the etymology, Latin from onus, and the definition, again, esteem, dignity, reputation, office. Now what happens if we go to onus, archaic form of honor? So you don't really get much more information than that. I was hoping for some kind of like, what does the Proto-Indo-European root actually signify? But yeah, so it seems like for many groups, for many high civilizations, honor is a critical concept, and the dissolution of an individual's honor does result seemingly in the dissolution of their will to live. And I think that's important. You need your desires to be integrated. And we have people who are seeking wealth, we have people who are seeking power, we have people who are seeking piety, but there's very few people, it seems, who are seeking this kind of integrated notion of honor, an integrated, highly valuable person, because we don't have any universal metric for that. Whereas in past societies, there was more of a general consensus. So it's very difficult to see yourself as an honorable person if the context that you're going to move in aren't going to speak the same language. And it's said that psychopaths often move every 3 or 4 years or less when they're kind of found out. And so they adopt behaviors that allow them to kind of fit in where they are and have the appearance of dignity, have the appearance of worthiness to the community, but it never really lasts. And I feel like our society is run by psychopaths, and we're being put in that kind of mindset where we are migrating constantly from community to community, and this results in necessarily kind of adapting this kind of dissociative, psychopathic approach to status and honor and morality, and you do see it all shifting very quickly. So if you wanted to reduce a people's will to live, that would be a very effective way of doing it.
Right. Yeah. It's it's kind of like I think you've said before, the notion of karma, that if you kill someone, you commit a homicide, then perhaps there's an understanding there that like that's going to come back to haunt you in some way, or there's some justice that's going to come down on you. Whereas if you can convince, there was actually a case where a young man or even a teenager's girlfriend encouraged him to commit suicide, said, you're a coward, just do it. I mean, these text messages are in the public now, and I mean, it's vicious. And there's a court case, trying to decide whether she is culpable for his death. And the argument, I guess, the lawyer is making is that if we ruled that she is culpable, then this would have terrible implications for freedom of speech, because then, you have people on Twitter saying, kill yourself. Is that now illegal if the person commits suicide? So I mean, it's a complicated, I guess, legal question. And that is why I think when you talk about if you're in control, right, and you're trying to have a population reduction or some kind of eugenics, or you're trying to eliminate people, essentially, do you do it by your own hand? Do you have like a plague or a war or something like that? Because that's usually what people think of. But in terms of when we look at the karmic implications or legal implications or anything, isn't it much more devious, and isn't it much more clever, devilishly clever, to engineer people's suicide? I mean, most people, if they're kind of predictable, and then even intelligent people, I think you've remarked, tend to be more sensitive to what's going on around them. If you look at the least suicidal people in America, it's African Americans, and they just, supposedly they're oppressed and they're poor and all these terrible violences going on, them police brutality, but their suicide rate is the least. And the people who have the highest, and it's not women. That's the other thing. People would think if it's just down to sensitivity, like the sensitivity or the emotionalism, then you would think, oh, it would have to be like Asian women or white women or something. And that's not the case either. It's white men. So there has to be some kind of relation here. I think it might be an instinctual desire for honor. It might be a cultural thing that people recognize the past and the fact that we've lost something. But I think for white men, this concept of honor is so important, and they have no way to even access it. They have no way to even approach it. It's not like we were born into an honorable state and then through making bad choices, we've lost our honor. No, we were born into this void of honorlessness, and we have no way to get back to it, no way to access it, because even if we imitated the actions of our ancestors, we would still not like receive the social approval. In fact, we would be socially humiliated for acting in a way that our ancestors thought was honorable. So whereas before there was kind of this link between social status and honor, now there's like this, I almost want to say ancestral or vestigial concept of honor floating around there. And then you also have the very real social hierarchy, and they're at complete odds with one another. And that kind of dissonance, again, the lack of integration of these two concepts, leads to kind of a dissolution of personality. And then whether people commit physical suicide or not, whether they actually harm their own bodies, I think there is like a self-destructive urge. And Nietzsche talked about this. He said when the warrior no longer has outward enemies, he fights himself. And I think there is this self-destructive urge where actually, and again, I think it's relatively speaking a feature of white men, that they want to hurt themselves psychically, they want to hurt themselves spiritually. And so they do things like, and that can turn to drug abuse. It can manifest in a number of ways. It can manifest, I think, as transgenderism. There's a whole host of ways that can manifest, but it is this self-punishment and feelings of inadequacy and low self-esteem and all of these habits. I think it's all tied together, and I think it is ultimately predictable and engineered. Like, it's not, oh, whoops, we had the Industrial Revolution, and by accident, it had these unintended consequences, and now people are alienated and atomized. You could say there's a confluence between sort of perhaps there are some materialistic like accidents, but when you look at, you know, medieval alchemy in a way, medieval alchemy, even though you could say its methods were incorrect, it was striving for the kind of results that we've had with the Industrial Revolution and with the internet, you know, seeking to turn lead into gold. That desire of taking something essentially worthless and making it priceless is something that people do now on a daily basis, right? That's the act of the con man. He takes something worthless and sells it to you as this valuable object. And so that's, you know, more and more of a feature of our society versus something that's like, you know, based in blood and soil and very hard, concrete, fast, you know, stable, you know, concept of honor and things like that. Mm-hmm. So like the mutability, mercurial nature of society, this is, I think it's like a very logical consequence of what certain classes of people were very eager for even before they had the method of the Industrial Revolution. I think that kind of came about as a consequence of the desires of the people who, you know, ultimately would engineer that revolution. So I'm not sure that it's really accidental at all.
Right. I'm interested to look at why this is particular to white men to such a degree, the obsession with honor. It's not like other races don't care about it, but let's look at the conditioning from the Indo-European times and on, what was necessary to gain status, probably beyond the level of any merely tribal association, in this kind of like franchise distributed sovereignty system that was developed around 3200 BC in the vicinity of Ukraine in order to have access to grazing territory, and in order to retain your spoils, you had to have honor and status. But this honor and status is different than when the male and female social hierarchies are more integrated, as in a tribal circumstance. Because then the honorable thing, like, I don't know, think about what is honor to an African American. It's not the approval of, and I believe you talked about this in a recent video, it's not exactly the approval of his fellow men, his fellow warriors. It's like this more generalized social pull and influencing the social organism, and particularly like what's appealing to women. And that's the tribal circumstance. But with the introduction of the patriarchy, which may have been, at least in its historical instantiations that we know of in the West, an Indo-European invention, when the patriarchy develops, this notion of honor is very clearly differentiated from past notions of status or even dignity or being a moral person. And this honor is also related to glory. And I think maybe that's part of one of the virtues that we've omitted from some aspects of this discussion. And Mr. Coolmug says, men could join the military as an Erat's path to honor, but that is quickly being invaded and broken up as a male space and as a path to honor. Right. And we still have this reverence for the military, and there still is glory to be had. But yeah, I mean, I acknowledge the point that you're actually making there, that it's not that kind of space that it used to be. And if you look at the actual behavior of soldiers, like, there's some dishonorable conduct going on. Although it's not like in the Homeric tales, like these warriors weren't like moral characters in many respects. They did drink excessively. I mean, Germanic pagans drank excessively. Romans commented on how intemperate the Germans were with drink. But anyway, so yeah, that some of those influences are perennial as far as the dishonorable nature of being a soldier. But, you know, this question of glory, why do you want glory in the Indo-European context? Because it's not just the approval of your fellow men, but it's also your ability to, you know, galvanize them and form a Mannerbund, and then conduct raids. And the cattle raid is very essential to Indo-European mythic systems. So this glory is connected to honor. It's kind of like how magnanimity might be an extension of liberality or charity to a higher degree. So like a billionaire could be magnanimous in throwing this massive charity ball or something like that. That's a magnanimous act. Glory is like an extension of honor. And then honor incorporates some of these martial virtues in the Indo-European context by necessity. Because that was, when you talk about worthiness, like worthiness is related to worth, which is related to price, which is related to economic value. And so the worthiness of a man in the Indo-European systems was very closely related to their ability to fight. And then glory being not just your ability to fight, but your ability to lead. And so we need an enemy. And so we have plenty of enemies. So hey, that's good. The people who can conceptualize of their group within the broader Western civilization, so-called, that exists today, the people who can isolate that and think of who is their Mannerbund, what is their peer group, who are their fellow soldiers, if they can identify with them and think with them and think of status and virtue in that context, they can actually be energized by these circumstances. It can still be challenging, but you look at the contrast between white men on the right who are not ashamed of their history, and even though it's a marginal view and it's a low status view in the eyes of the greater society, they can still find honor in it and even potentially glory. So, you know, that's one other dimension, the whole glory aspect.
There's that Norse quote, kinsmen die, cattle die, but I know one thing which does not die. It's variously translated, but the one I'm looking at here is the good name never dies. And so the concept of like honor really being connected with not like your fame in life, but your fame after life, the fame after you die. And when you're talking about like, what is a Black conception or African American conception of honor, or status, or like what are they seeking? Who are they seeking to impress? It is very much centered on like, in this life, how much status can you acquire? And the idea of like, you know, who's going to remember you after you're dead? Well, doesn't really figure into the picture, versus something where that's the only thing that matters. And there is an element to which you have to have like a strong, oh, go ahead.
It's just interesting thinking about it. There are zero historical Black heroic figures beyond like the past 300 years. There's nothing. There's no record of them. They have no ancient role models to look to.
Yeah, I mean, well, they've tried to appropriate Egypt and be like, you know, King Tut, or I don't know. I mean, and they've tried to appropriate the King of England, or, you know, he was a Moorish king or something like that. Like, you know, so there are attempts there. But I think it is interesting that like even Martin Luther King, I think probably educated Black women will like probably maybe look up to him, or maybe like educated Black men might pay him lip service. But when you talk about like the base, like when we talk about the white working class, what is the equivalent for the Black community? Like the base of the Black community doesn't necessarily revere Martin Luther King in the same way they revere whoever like the latest rapper is. And like there are some dead rappers that have like some high value, but sometimes it's like white people actually revere those, like Biggie, for instance. Like, oh, you know, he died too early and blah, blah, blah. And it's almost like white people have more reverence for him than the actual Black community, because they're so focused on like what's happening now, what's the latest fashion now. Like, and when you talk about the concept of honor so much, it's like one of the reappearing themes is I'm so high status that I can steal your women, like saying it addressed to other Black men, which is like kind of the opposite of, you know, a traditional European concept of honor, that like an honorable man might be someone who dies a virgin, right? Think about who is it? The one that the marathon. His name. Maybe his name is Marathon.
No,
But
yeah, I know what you're talking about.
The origin. Yeah, it's the Battle of Marathon, where the guy, maybe he died. I guess his name was Biodipides, perhaps.
The
And
runner,
maybe
right?
he died of. Yeah, he's the runner, right? And we don't really care how many chicks he slayed in his lifetime, because he had this honorable death, and he's remembered because of this sacrifice that he made of his own, like, personal biological value. He sacrificed that for something bigger than himself, and he showed these ideal virtues of, like, perseverance and endurance and everything, loyalty. So those things, and I think I've talked about this previously, those things are totally at odds with one another. They're completely inverted. And it's almost as if there's a very neat fitting together here, where if you promote a Black conception of honor or social status in society generally, and you hold that up and you say, this is the standard by which we hold ourselves, the corollary is a kind of engineered suicide of white men, because they look at that and they say, that's completely repulsive to me. That's completely the opposite of what I aspire to. And so, what place is there for me in society? And there's this internal struggle that goes on that leads to the self-destruction. So, as you take one thing and idealize that, the corollary is that those who don't fit that ideal or are opposed to that then are driven into this self-destruction, the necessity that you can't, it's very difficult to live in a society and not somehow internalize the ideals of that society. On the other hand, it's very hard to unroot yourself from ancestral, whether that's a genetic inheritance or a cultural inheritance. And so then you have these two ideals fighting inside yourself. And, like, the consequences for things like self-esteem is disastrous, that the whole thing entirely dissolves and you can't overcome that. And there's, like, there are people, I guess, like Eminem or white rappers who try desperately to, change their notions of what is ideal, change their notions of, what it means to be a man, and try to fit in with that. And at the end of the day, they can gain some kind of social status from that. But it is, like, something that a lot of people look down. I mean, the Black community will look at white rappers always with some degree of suspicion or some degree of, oh, well, maybe someday he's going to turn out to. And I think that's why Eminem has gone so hard against Donald Trump. He's, like, trying to still desperately prove himself. And I think at the end of the day, that does come from a place of low self-esteem. So it's not a solution to adopt the values and the ideals of someone who's foreign and hostile to you. At the end, that's only going to produce, like, an endless degree of, like, striving toward that which you cannot become. On the other hand, just remaining loyal and true to yourself is not a perfect solution either. So, like, this is something that almost everyone has to deal with to one extent or another.
Right. It works one way and not the other, as far as the prevailing sense of honor or glory affecting people who don't match it. Because space-time DCR says there must be a relationship between capacity for abstraction, which means IQ, and leisure time and suicide. We can see this in the history of aristocracy. So, more abstract thinking white men in a context where the Black virtues are elevated will be susceptible to, like, this kind of conflict between their abstract ideals and then their own sense of value immediately, whereas a Black person who doesn't have as much abstraction going on doesn't necessarily run into that. So that's a good point. But why does the Roman aristocrat kill themselves? The people who have the IQ and the leisure time, the historical examples, it is this very high status group that ends up doing it. And from my mind, like, that relates to, I've said before, Romans would not endure slavery, they would rather kill themselves. And Rattle talks about how the distinction between a Roman soldier and a Celtic or German warrior, where in Norse literature, Norse people wanted glory and fame even more than to win. And that's related, that's maybe a more extreme version of the Roman tendency to not put up with living under circumstances that don't match their ideal of glory or ideal of virtue. And that, today we have people who maybe, white men who live in the past to some extent, who like the idea of glory that they see in their histories, when they realize like the circumstance doesn't allow them to embody it, they take the Roman way out. They take that kind of idealistic version in many instances, where they just say, this isn't the kind of life that I want to live. Virtue is more important to me than living. And I think that's a very visceral kind of proof that when we look at like an inductive study of morality, an empirical study of morality, existence does not precede the essence of moral phenomena. The essence of them is prior, because people are willing to sacrifice existence under certain conditions. Right, there are certain things that a person has to have, like leisure time, like abstraction, like the ability to think about these things. Because if you exist in this flow, and I've thought about this before, like, why is rap such a big thing in the black community? Why is basketball such a big thing? Because flow states are essential for those activities, and flow states mean not engaging in abstraction. Now, there are many great things you can do in a flow state. Like, I studied the French horn. I've performed in many, many concerts. And if you get into a space where you're using abstraction and thinking about what you're doing, you perform very poorly. If you get into a flow state, you perform well. But anyway, if you're in a flow state permanently, this kind of dissonance never occurs, and you just act. But at the same time, you don't get this ideal of immortality. Immortality means escaping the flow of time. And the Germanic warrior, the Indo-European warrior generally, would rather have that everlasting fame, everlasting glory, where they escape time, than continue to live in a condition that's not up to their highest ideal. And then let me see if there's any other comments I want to look at. There was a famous Mr. Cool Mug, there was a famous British colonialist who died a virgin. I forget his name, but there was a famous painting of him standing above a staircase of Mohammedans. He died defending the empire from something that's derogatory, he says. So, George Gordon. Yeah, so this ideal, living up to an ideal and sacrificing the necessary aspects of engagement in time, that's like, what would you call it? Sublimation of this drive for glory, of this drive for immortality. That can be sublimated into the piety of the priest or the monk. It can be sublimated into the obsessive activity of the scientist or the colonialist. It appears in many contexts and is probably necessary for the kind of Western excellence and exceptionalism we've seen. You have to be willing to sacrifice. You have to be willing to live for the ideal, live for the immortal aspect rather than the mortal. So, I've always had kind of mixed feelings about suicide. Like, honor should be more important than life. That's the way our ancestors saw it. And if you have a society where some exceptional portion of the population is willing to live that way, is not willing to endure servitude, who always fights to the last for being free, for being immortal, then that society as a whole will end up surviving to a greater extent than the one that's all engaged in the flow and one with life. Life isn't all it's cracked up to be. There should be some conflict between the death principle as well.
Yeah, so if you have, you could talk about aristocratic degeneration in this way. if at some point you're not willing to sacrifice your own individual life for something greater, then you have no moral code, essentially. I mean, your only moral code is your own individual survival, which, you know, can mean anything in any place. If you live in a moral society, then that would mean, okay, I have to act morally in order to promote myself here. But if you live in just, I mean, you could then make any law and then you would follow that law because you want to promote yourself. So if at some point, you know, people are not willing to say, look, I've made a mistake, I've lost my honor, it's time for me to depart from this aristocracy, it's time for me to depart from the breeding population of this class of people. If you don't have that, then the consequence is that you basically get this aristocratic degeneration where people say, no, I'm an aristocrat, I can do whatever I want, I don't care what ills have, you know. And people can look today, and I like this this example of the rape of Lucretia in like the modern context. We would think that that, like, we talk about the survivor, we talk about someone who is a victim of abuse and they're a survivor and they go on and they overcome that and they choose not to commit suicide and they choose to, like, you know, absolve themselves of the abuse and whatever. And that is like the braver option, that is the better option. That's not how it was originally viewed. It was originally viewed that, you know, whether it's your fault or not your fault, if you become stained to a point that, you know, there's some things you cannot reverse, then it is better to depart with your honor than to, you know, cling on and stay and remain. And like there was, it was again a concept of the integrity of the personality, that you would say, you know, once a certain amount of damage has been done, like a man who's humiliated in battle. There are stories of, you know, like kings being injured in battle and telling their, you know, telling their soldiers or whatever, just finish me off, kill me, because I've been wounded. I could survive, but I've been humiliated. You need to finish the job because I cannot go on as your king. Like, you would still be loyal to me, but I would be like a shadow of the man I once was. And for the greater good, I cannot allow that to happen. You have to end my life so that something else can come in my place. And that something else coming in my place is a kind of concept of reincarnation. It is a concept that there is something that goes on after this life. And you eliminate that, you take that away, and it's just this you only live once mentality. And that strips away a lot of the ethos behind suicide. It strips away a lot of the ethos behind honor. And so when people, you know, do commit suicide, I think it is a lot of times for unconscious reasons. Like if we're talking statistically, of course, we can point out to people who are very methodical in their decision. But in cases where it's simply a self-destructive urge has led them to an impulsive act, which is much of the way that suicide's characterized today. It's never characterized as something noble. It's always characterized as something, you know, selfish, and it's characterized as cowardly and so on and so forth. But whatever conscious process has driven people to the point, I think the key thing is to understand that their unconscious, pre-conscious process is going on here, which are this conflict of a disintegration of personality. So
right.
That's...
So relating to that reincarnation ideal and disintegration, one way of looking at it would be there are a fixed number of archetypes. There are a fixed number of eternal personalities that are visible in the gods. And you would rather match yourself onto the model of one of these archetypes and live up to that archetype, like the archetype of the knight or the warrior or the king, and you would rather die in accordance with that archetype than live on and have it disintegrated. The integrity of their personality is more important. And I think that's, you know, I know that Jay Dyer may disagree with me as far as the definition of personality, but to my mind, personality is a mask, but that doesn't make it inauthentic. Personality is a character that you build, and if it's not well constructed, if it doesn't have that integrity, then there's no real reason to have it. I don't think people are really born with personality. They're born with an animalistic will. And eventually they may have some kind of self-reflection event where they gain a new kind of sentience or self-reflection. And this then opens up the door to like, how do other people see me? And this interaction then results in the formation of a personality, generally by default. It's possible for the personality to be broken down again. That's part of what makes the shaman the shaman. And there's like this kind of first naive personality, which is random. It's organized by chaotic forces, right? And then there's the super personal after you encounter this like this rupture of the childlike persona. Once that's ruptured, and that's why the manhood initiations have some kind of traumatic event. You go through a lot of pain. You do something that makes you question who you are. And then after that, the super personal can interact with your new construction of your persona. And there's a couple routes from there. You do the knightly thing or the kingly thing and live in accordance with that new persona. And that's your commitment to it is absolute. Or you remain the shaman and, consciously not adopt one persona and kind of live behind many masks. But then that's still like an archetype outside of the archetypes. It's the archetype that surveys them and lays the scene in some respect, which, is something else to consider here. Because they have their own sort of honor, but like they wouldn't be the heroic, tragic figure to like, commit seppuku after a loss. They would just handle it in a different sort of way, I think. And then Mr. Coolmug is arguing suicide is ignoble. It's not really a sacrifice, but I suppose it depends on the context. Take the case of Nick Drake or Kurt Cobain. They didn't die noble deaths. They died in shame, in the shadow of drug use. Yes, there are suicides which are ignoble. I think there are suicides which are noble, though. The ignoble kind is where you just can't bear the suffering. And so the loss of integrity is like the neurochemical, physical being. And that would be this rupture. That would be basically failing the transition from the childlike persona, the chaotic persona, into the super personal aspect where you accord with an archetype, because you never really committed to living up to a higher ideal. You were simply always motivated by your base will. And then when your will was continually thwarted, you couldn't stand it, and the disintegration led to suicide. That's an ignoble suicide. A noble one is where you do successfully become a man, and adopt a higher level of personality, and then something happens that doesn't allow the continuance of this higher personality, and you say, I'd rather end it than sacrifice on that higher ideal. I think that's noble, my opinion. Yeah. Well, and then Spacetime makes a good point about those people. Both were highly idealistic and became eternal in their work. So that is an alternative form of immortality. Even though they died an ignoble death, that's still like the character does live on as a tragic character, right? And I don't think anyone really should aspire to gain immortality as a tragic character.
Yeah, there's two kind of questions here. Like when you say suicide is not a noble act because, like, look at Kurt Cobain, would we ever consider him to be noble? Well, you almost have to question if he had continued living the way that he was living and continued promoting the kind of culture and message that he was promoting, would it have been nobler to live on or to end that? And so then you have a different sort of question there. Like, can a unnoble person commit a noble act? And then, of course, there is a distinction between someone who lives nobly, something bad happens, something tragic happens, and then they commit suicide. versus someone who does not live nobly and then is like fears being, you know, tortured or something as a result of their crimes and then commits suicide to avoid torture. Like those are two very different things. But yeah, I think at the end of the day, if like when we talk about suicide, we don't have to talk about it strictly in terms of someone like purposefully ending their life in a direct way. There's also like the Battle of Thermopylae. Like, what did those Spartan soldiers do? Effectively, they were on a suicide mission. So there's when we talk about suicide, it's not just this discrete one thing, but it's actually a whole range of actions and decisions that we make in our life that lead to self-sacrifice that can either be ignoble, that can be purposeless or selfish or whatever, hurt other people, but there can also be noble ways of self-sacrifice.
It kind of occurred to me there that there's also and you briefly alluded to it, but just to make it explicit, there's the ignoble person who dies a noble death upon like recognition of their lack of nobility. And I don't know if this is an actual memory of a film that I watched, but I feel like one of those, they came out around the same time. It was like about a meteor coming to hit the Earth, and they sent both movies, they have to send out a mission to stop the meteor. In one of them, one of the characters is like this kind of doesn't have a family, like was a big drinker, just not a morally upright kind of person. And in the end, when some technical failure happens, and also maybe they get to know some kid or someone who represents purity, right, and befriends them. Kind of like, I didn't watch this, but I've seen the memes where there's the Iron Man befriends the young Spider-Man, and that's like that kind of relationship where it's the old like wayward kind of lost soul and then the young pure like aspiring person, and that creates a change in the older person. That's an archetype anyway. But when this happens in this movie I'm talking about, like some technical failure happens and somebody has to stay behind and hit the button effectively, that kind of circumstance. And you know, that's what's demonstrated there when the old guy does it, because he like there's a purity that his life didn't have that maybe his death could have. So I don't know what you would call that kind of suicide, but that's also noble, even though it's not a noble person doing it. And that redemption in death is something as well.
But yeah, you're thinking of Independence Day.
No, not Independence Day.
You
I am thinking of Independence Day. Damn, you're right.
Yeah,
you're right.
That he's an alcoholic, and he like, it's a funny thing. It's an interesting thing because I don't know. There was some film class that went through that specific instance and talked about all of that. So anyway, yeah, that is something that's powerful, and it's supposed to be like the character of Gollum in the Lord of the Rings is like this ambiguous figure where it's like, could this ignoble person ever produce anything good? And ultimately he does die. The question is that ultimately good? Did he die like with evil? Like, so it's kind of ambiguous throughout the plot line there which way it's going to turn out, and you could see it kind of going either way, and depending on how you interpret it, like, is his last act the most important thing, or was it the progression that led up to the act? Like, exactly what's going on there. So yeah, I mean, I just don't think, like, obviously when you talk about suicide, it's kind of rubbing up against like an kind of antinatalism that I encounter, where it's like, okay, you're smart, you're an abstract thinker, you're intelligent, you're feeling bereft of honor in an honorless world. Like, you have all these traits that are noble and can be used for good, and you're the type of person who's most likely to commit suicide. Okay, I kind of want to convince you not to do that, because I'd like to enlist you as someone who can, you know, help the rest of us who are not looking to commit suicide, and we're looking to try to make the best we can out of a bad situation. And there is, I kind of think that not just like the physical suicide enabling you to do heroic acts like, you know, Battle of Thermopylae type of sacrifice in battle, but there's also the mentality of someone who feels they have nothing left to lose. This is a common superhero trope, like the Punisher, or someone like he's lost his wife and children, he's lost his family, he's lost his will to live, and now it's just like his body is animated by this pure desire for justice, and so that allows him to take these superhuman risks and confront death, and he just has this fearlessness that is like superhuman and allows him to do what needs to be done. I mean, we can talk. There's actually a book about Andy Nowicki. I don't know. It's called Enter the Nihil, I believe, and it's basically the premise of it is like the United States government sees like the jihadis who are willing to commit suicide as like the ultimate weapon and tries to engineer a kind of like jihadi for the United States government. And I haven't read the book, but that's basically the premise. So like there's something powerful about that. Now, if you just go and destroy your life without helping other people, you sort of lose the potency of that mentality. But I think when we ask ourselves, why do people commit suicide? Why is there this urge towards suicide? You can see examples of where it would actually be the most beneficial thing in a certain time and place to have that mindset in order to promote some kind of greater good. So it is like, it's an important thing, but it's also a very precarious thing, where it can either go in a very good direction or it can go in a very bad direction. But it's a powerful force in society. And so to see it on the rise and to see it affecting certain populations, I think it's something that has to be talked about, because it's going to have implications for what the future looks like, essentially.
All right. Well, before we lose our integrity as a stream, we probably want to wrap up. Before we do, I might want to get on Discord later on this evening and hopefully start having some group conversations. I think that would be productive. Ken, are you free at some point much later this evening?
I might be available after 8 p.m. or 10 p.m. I can update you on that later today.
All right. Well, then provisionally, I'll leave a message in the Discord. I'll also add the Discord link in the description for after the stream is over. But yeah, we'll shoot for like 9:30 or 10 or something like that to be on Discord. But anyway, thanks you guys for listening, and we'll try to do this next Saturday or sooner. But
sure.
Bye-bye.